As of late, I've been getting some requests to do a knife throwing tutorial for beginners, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this video. Stick around. I just wanted to take a moment to greet everybody, and if you're new to this channel, I wanted to take time to welcome you to 411 Outdoors. I hope you find this information helpful. Let's get started. Before getting into this tutorial, I want to throw out a few disclaimers that I feel are needed before we get started. Number one, this is probably the longest video I've ever uploaded to YouTube because I want to be thorough enough for the new beginners. Number two, there are some dangers to knife throwing, especially when the blade bounces back towards you, so do knife throwing at your own risk. Number three, although I may be very passionate and dedicated to knife throwing, I don't consider myself to be the top of the line in knife throwing. There are people that are light years ahead of me in knife throwing, and if there is anything that I have gleaned from these individuals along the way, I'll be sure to share that as well. With that being said, just because I'm not the most well-known knife thrower and furthest along does not mean that I can't teach what I'm passionate about or teach what I feel will help you. The things I teach are obviously not the only way things can be done. I'm just going to show you my favorite way of doing things, and if you can learn something, that's awesome. Number five, there are different reasons why people get into knife throwing. Maybe yours is recreational. Maybe you want to eventually get into competitions. Maybe you want to get into the combative or tactical side of it. It's good to think about what motivates you when it comes to knife throwing because it will guide your thought process and your training. So before we get into knife throwing, we've got to talk about knives. There are a lot of different throwing knives out on the market. If you just go out to Amazon and you type throwing knives, what you're going to discover is there's this long list of items available to you, from very inexpensive options to more expensive options and sometimes very expensive options. It is my opinion that a throwing knife should have some weight and substance to it. When I first got into knife throwing, I was going for the cheapest options and I was buying these light, flimsy throwing knives, and it took me forever to progress as a knife thrower. And it seems like when I started throwing knives that had weight and substance, I started immediately improving. I don't believe you have to spend a lot of money to have good throwing knives or to get into knife throwing. If you want to spend more money, you can. And as you get into this sport, you're going to find out about knives that cost a whole lot that may gain your interest. But I want to show you three in this particular video, three that I use on a regular basis. One is on the lighter end, one is heavier, and one is very heavy. So I got my start in knife throwing using these Smith & Wesson throwing knives. Now let me tell you why I've got this thing wrapped in goon tape. These knives are inexpensive and they chip, and you get these metal shards in your finger and it really hurts. So I got tired of doing that, so I tape these things up. These are like $17 a set and they're right at 5 ounces, maybe a little bit less. That's as light as I would want to go with a throwing knife. But here's the problem with something this small. It's hard to get a good grip. It's hard to get good control over a knife like this. I'm either doing no spin throwing or some kind of pinch grip throwing with these. So if you're going to get something like this, it's going to be very limited. Another knife that I'm a big fan of though is the True Flight thrower from Cold Steel. This is probably 12 to 13 inches long, 12 to 13 ounces. This is a good solid throwing knife that you can get for about $22, $23, and I recommend getting a True Flight thrower right off the bat. If you want to go with something big and heavy, you can get the Perfect Balance thrower from Cold Steel. This is a big Bowie knife. It weighs almost a pound. It is a monster, 5 millimeters thick. You see how long this is. This is just a monster of a throwing knife. And these are three different examples of knives that you can get, whether light, whether heavy, or very heavy. If I had to pick one out of the three, and just one, I would get the True Balance thrower, which is the second one that I showed you. It's just balanced. It's got the size, the weight. It's not too heavy, and it seems to be good for all forms of throwing. Again, these are just my recommendations. I just believe that having substance to your throwing knife is going to make it easier for you to progress. Now, on to the next point, which is styles of throwing. You have half spin, full spin, and no spin throwing, and we're going to be going through the basics of those in this tutorial. Rotational throws are absolutely governed by distance, whereas no spin is not as governed by distance. Now that we've talked about our disclaimers, getting the right kinds of tools, and getting familiar with the different kinds of throws, we can now move to the next portion of our video, which is half spin throwing. There's a lot of different angles we could come at half spin throwing, but I just want to keep it as basic as possible. Half spin throwing is done by holding the end of the blade. Some knife throwers like to put their dominant leg in the back and throw this way, whereas some like to rest on their dominant leg. Jason Johnson, aka Pro Knife Thrower, really turned me on to resting on my dominant leg, and it has really improved my rotational throwing. With that being said though, you can keep your dominant leg in the back or your dominant leg in the front. It ultimately comes down to what you're most comfortable with. As far as the release is concerned, just let the knife come out of your hand. Don't hold on too tight. You want to have a grip on the knife, but you want to be relaxed. For half spin throwing, the knife's going to come up and you're just going to come down and you're going to be letting go. You're going to let the knife come out of your hand about right here. Here's what it's going to look like. Make sure when you throw the knife that you're throwing it down like a slice and letting go on the way down. With knife throwing, it's really easy to get caught up into throwing it like a baseball and it gets the blade all twisted. You want to keep the knife on a smooth, straight pattern. Also let you see this from another angle. So the knife came out of my hand and did 1/2 rotation before making the connection. You especially want to use caution when you're doing half spin throwing because you're much more susceptible to getting hit by the knife if it bounces back because you're so close to the target. I took a terrible wound to the hand one time. I got too overzealous and slung the knife and it hit and came right back at me, and when I went to protect myself, the knife hit my hand and it was pretty bad. When you're throwing knives, just try to anticipate the fact that things like that can happen. And number two, don't get too overzealous. Don't just carelessly sling the knife. That's very dangerous. When you throw the knife, let it be a nice controlled release. If you'll keep those things in mind, you will most likely be able to prevent injury in knife throwing. All right, with this being a tutorial for beginners, I'm going to go ahead and move on from the half spin portion of this tutorial into full rotation throwing. Full rotation throwing means that the knife comes out of your hand and the knife does 1 full rotation before it makes its connection. With rotational throwing, there are several different ways you can hold the knife depending upon your exact location as to where you stand. You know, sometimes the distance may change a foot, a half a foot, depending upon how you hold the knife. For example, if you want to get the quickest rotational throw at the shortest distance, you can hold the end of the knife like this. If you grip it up a little higher and hammer grip it here, you're going to add a little bit more distance. And if you put your thumb on the back here, you can add a little bit more distance. Some people will also pinch grip. I used to do a lot of that, but I'm really no longer a fan of that. But that really shortens the distance as well. As you're going through the learning curve of rotational throwing, which can be very frustrating, pay attention to something. If your knife is hitting here consistently, it means you're too close. If your knife is hitting here, it means you're a little bit too far away. So if you can pay close attention to where the knife is hitting, you can make your adjustments. You may be wondering if there is ever a way to become instinctive with rotational throwing, being that it's governed by distance. And I will say to you, yes, you can become largely instinctive with this once you've been doing it for a while. You just start to kind of get familiar with the distances the more you do it. I'm probably going to be filming this video over a series of days, and that's why you see me now in some different clothing. Let's get into some rotational throwing, and I'm going to start by holding the end of the handle like this. I'm just going to demonstrate a rotational throw for you. Again, you can put your dominant leg forward or backwards. You want to bring the knife up straight. You want to slice down straight, and you just want to let the knife fly out of your hand about right here. There is a little bit of a distance change whether you put your dominant leg forward or backward. You just have to experiment a little bit. With this first throw, I'm going to be about 9 feet from the target. So here's how my knife landed. This is a perfect example of what I was saying earlier. This is slightly over rotated. I'm glad that it stuck, but if you see your knife landing like this, you can make some adjustments and come a little bit closer. I made a slight adjustment forward, and as you can see, the blade is in there straight. Now, if you go from here to here, you can back up about 6 inches. And if you go from here to here, you can back up another 6 inches. The reason why you can go back so much further with your thumb here is that this slows down the rotation just a little bit. Once you start to get this distance thing mastered a little bit, you can try doubling your distance and doubling your rotation. I want to talk about the importance of comfort when you're throwing knives, because there's a lot of things that can change your game. You might be trying to throw in an environment where you have to be really careful, where there's not a lot of margin for error. I know sometimes when I'm throwing in my basement, I'm worried about, you know, the knife bouncing off and hitting something, or landing on my cement floor and breaking my tip. And I just throw so very apprehensively in an environment like that. And sometimes I don't throw as well when I'm inside. I throw better when I'm outside and I'm not worried about the implications of where the knife might fall. Clothing matters. If you're wearing uncomfortable clothing that you can't move well in, get comfortable. Get in something you can move in. Knife throwing is also physically demanding. There are times when I try to get out and throw knives and I'm just tired and lethargic. Maybe the week has caught up with me. I don't tend to throw as well. I throw my best when I'm mentally and physically somewhat on top of my game. I want to share this from experience. From time to time, you may get into this groove where you're missing one throw after the next, and you just find your blood beginning to boil and you're getting more and more frustrated. When that happens, don't just keep throwing. Start paying attention to some of the form. Start paying attention to some of the reasons why that might be happening, because we can't make up for bad throws with more throws. We have to make up for bad throwing by taking a look at our form and looking at some of the possibilities as to why we're not making the connection. All right, let's move into no spin throwing. And what I'm going to do is show you the way that I do no spin throwing right now. I'm always learning new ways on how to do this, but I want to communicate the simplest way to get into no spin throwing. I personally find it to be the most difficult, especially when it comes to distance. Up to a certain distance, I don't find it that difficult, but the dynamic begins to change. What we're going to stick with in this tutorial is just learning to do no spin within the same distance that you would do a full rotation. Now with this style of throwing, I do put my dominant leg back, okay? And the first way that I learned to do no spin throwing was with my index finger holding the blade like this. Again, there are a million different tutorials on this, but this is how I learned to do it. And this is about where I keep my finger if I'm doing anything within a full rotation, 9, 10, 11 feet range. Okay, this is how I keep my finger. And what's happening is I'm pulling back, okay? I'm pulling back like this, and I'm going forward. And as I'm going forward, I'm letting my finger slide off the blade like this with a slight push and a thrust from my body. What I'm not doing is slinging with my arm. It'll always over-rotate if you do that. This is the work of your body coming together to create a motion, to send this thing through the air like an arrow. Try to pay attention to everything. Pay attention to how the knife comes out of my hand, and pay attention to the torque that comes from my body. It's important you see this from another angle, such as this one. Another way that I'll do no spin throwing is to put the blade here and to let the blade come out of my hand like this. Here's what it looks like. There is one other way that I do no spin. Not like this, but actually holding the handle. And I lied to you earlier when I said I don't do no spin with my dominant leg forward. But on this particular method, I do. I cannot do this from far away, holding the handle. This is within probably 7 to 8 feet max range. Here's what it looks like. One of the best ways that I can describe no spin throwing is it's almost like when the knife comes out of your hand, it's like the tail end of a whip that's cracking. Your arm's not slinging it because you will always over-rotate when you're doing that. But when your body's in one motion and you have that torque moving and you crack that thing out, it can send that blade in a straight flight. Hopefully that'll give you enough basic fundamentals to get started in all of these types of knife throwing. I didn't want to go too in depth with anything on this video. I just want to get you started on some of the main points. Even with no spin, those are just some basic fundamentals. Listen, the knife throwing world is just full of incredibly talented people out there. And there's some great YouTube channels out there like Celadin, Pro Knife Thrower. Full Tang Clan, and several others. I could stand here and list a lot of them out, but I'll drop some links in the description for you to go check out their channels as well and glean from them. I'm on Instagram and connected to a huge knife throwing community, a lot of great people, a lot of great talent. This is just a big, broad world full of a lot of throwers that you can glean from, and I hope that you have found this video tutorial helpful, and I hope it helps get you started. Take care.